Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores big issues and ideas in a conversational way.
My name is Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kurapati.
And I'm Tom Spare.
So, in today's episode, we're turning our attention to education, public service, and what it's like to be a government and history teacher in the United States in 2025.
So we're thrilled to be joined by Chad Mott, a high school teacher from Evergreen, Colorado, with decades of experience in the classroom.
He has taught a variety of history and government courses to high school students, which are typically young people between the ages of 14 and 18 in the US, just for the international context. I had the opportunity to be in 3 of Mr. Mott's courses: AP US History, AP Comparative Government, and AP US Government. And yes, as you might have guessed from the last names, I have an even more personal connection to our guest today. Mr. Mott is also my dad. So I also have an ulterior motive with this episode, because having him on this podcast will pretty much cement me as his favorite child, right?
I was going to ask about.
Right. Yeah, let's see how this episode goes. So Chad brings a unique perspective, not just on how young people are understanding politics today, but also on how recent political developments, especially the return of Donald Trump to the White House, have shaped the classroom and the role of public education.
We'll also be asking Chad/Dad about his path into teaching, how public education is faring across the country, and whether today's students are more or less interested in becoming public servants.
And of course, as a teacher, preparing students for life after high school in a world that feels more and more uncertain than ever, we'll also hear his advice for the class of 2025.
So let's get started. Mr. Mott, Dad, welcome to the Political Dispatch. It's great to have you here with us today to talk about the state of education in the U.S. We caught you at the perfect time, summer break. So thank you for taking the time off to talk with us. Of course, I know a little bit about this story, but for Tom and Sid and for all of our listeners, can you tell us about your path to become a teacher? What got you into the profession? Give us the whole story.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's an honor to be here. Wonderful to be with you, and especially in a format where you don't have to wear trousers. I really enjoy this.
We do too. The glories of podcasting.
Very, very intimate and yet professional at the same time. I'm a big fan. So, yeah, as far as my background, it's, certainly Lily understands all of this, but I was raised by a political science professor, right? So I grew up on a small liberal arts college in the East Coast of the United States, very historical place. And I think there's a lot to be said, of course, in political science. We talk about primacy tendency, where, your family is your most important influence, right? And they influence you in a couple of different ways, important ways, which you may not even really understand until much later in your life. But first is establishing kind of your political views, those values, those perspectives are out there, but also, that your family's influence in terms of their perspective on service, on government, and how important the role that is. Those things stick with you, whether you reject your own family eventually, whether you embrace that. Those are all very, very important. And for me, when I think back and think, I was a kid who, by the earliest ages of 3 or 4 years old, was heavily influenced by my dad's awareness, his political activism, the involvement growing up on a college campus. I mean, I can literally remember, watching the news. This was during the latter stages of Vietnam. I marched on Washington when I was 5 years old, guys. So, there was no separating that for me. In fact, one of the stories I told Lily was that in 1972, at the ripe age of 5 years old, I got in trouble on the public school bus for campaigning for George McGovern against Richard Nixon at the age of 5. I don't remember this, but my parents remember me being called into the principal's office to stop being political on the public school bus at age 5. So when eventually I got out of college, I went to work in Washington. I worked on Capitol Hill, the thought being, be part of that whole cauldron, that staffing thing, because it's a great place to be when you're that age. And then after a few months of that, I decided that the only way to make sure that I was going to be able to advance along that career path was to go to law school. So I went to law school, and when I was in law school, I realized that my real passion was for the information and for the teaching part of it, the education. As I said, my father was a professor. My uncle was a professor. 2 different uncles of mine were both headmasters of private schools. And so the teaching part of it, the education, was really in my DNA. And so after law school, I went into a teaching program and And really from the very first day, I realized that was, if there is such a thing as a calling, that was going to be mine. And the nice thing with working in Washington and my experience in law school is that it gave me educational insight, perspective, information that most basic public school teachers do not have. It's allowed me to kind of enrich my own classes. So it worked out well that way in history, teaching history and government. So it's been a fortuitous path, and I have no real regrets, about any of that. I do, and we could have a discussion about how we value certain professions. That's another podcast, I suppose. But we're here more to talk about my perspective on state of education, right, and politics in all of that. So what else would you like to know about today's young people and education?
Well, first, I want to just say a quick thank you for all of that, because I think then a lot of that passed down into me as well. And I kind of have stuck with that whole trend of things. Mine is in a little bit of a different way, but I think service nonetheless. Tom said something that my dad always said to my siblings and I growing up was, to whom much is given, much is expected. So I think that's something that each of my siblings, we've kind of embodied in a different way. So I wanted to say a thank you publicly on this podcast. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I've got my grandmother was a teacher all of her life, and I think she taught both my mum and my uncle. Definitely my uncle was in their class, but she was very strict, basically.
Yeah. Well, European style tends to be a little bit more kind of detached, right? A little bit more, distance, more that tutorial, as opposed to what Americans have always espoused is a lot more immersive, a lot more relationship based, with the kids. So it's a different atmosphere. I understand that.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose it works quite well, because the first question is, can you provide an overview of the state of education in the United States at the moment, particularly when it comes to public education? Because I think in the UK, there's a sense of education being quite sort of centralized. There's sort of like an idea of, this is how kids should be taught, this is how teachers should be trained. So what's the sort of overview of education in the United States?
Yeah, I think it's important for the listeners to understand, of course, that the American system, in education is reflective of our federal system of government generally, which means, we have in education cooperative federalism would be the proper term, but it basically means that there are different layers of authority, right? Different layers of control and authority. So, all the attention is paid to, President Trump and the Department of Education. But the reality is that in different states, because of in our system, the powers that are not directly delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states, which means there's going to be a shared sense of responsibility and authority. So nothing is completely centralized. So when we think about, over the years, that's given us opportunities to be somewhat independent, but and be more state-based and regional and cultural on those levels, but also with a thread of constitutionality, which means that there has to be a certain level of consistency, at all the schools in terms of civil rights, in terms of services and expectations of what's provided. But the reality is that you have multi-levels of control and influence in terms of the way the system is built. So the federal government has a role to play, but when it comes to public education, it's really more a state and a local issue. So now to circle back to kind of today's politics with that, when you hear, President Trump wants to dismantle, the Department of Education, that sounds like he's trying to get rid of all public schools in general. That's not really true, right? It's more of a kind of a talking point and an organizing point. It's just another headline grabbing kind of a thing. Now, the influence that it will have, though, is some chaos legally, because the Department of Education and the federal government in the United States are the guarantors of civil rights. And so when it comes to things like special education, gender equity, whether it's, sexual orientation, whatever it might be, they are the guarantor of that. And of course, we're still very, very, very cognizant of the problems we've had, historically with that. A lot of Americans kind of forget this, but it's only been 60 years since we've had integrated classrooms in the South, for example, right? And so when you look at that, you say, well, there's the role of the Department of Education. That's why it was created in the 1970s in particular, right? That's not always been a part of our system. It came about in the 1970s to ensure that kind of top-down consistency, okay? Now, what we are seeing is that public education is being, kind of caught up in the culture wars that we have going on politically as well, right? And so In a state like Colorado, where I live, there is nothing new. There's no downward pressure, at least until there's some legal changes. But the federal government doesn't tell us what to teach or how to teach it. Whereas some of the more extreme red states, right, the more conservative states, okay, in America, are taking this opportunity to try to really push back against what they consider to be, too much liberalism, too much inclusion, and they want to go back. When you think about the movement of Make America Great Again, the more cynical answer to that would be, 1955, take us back 65 years, take us back 70 years, where we don't have integrated schools, where we don't guarantee equal rights, where we, don't have to put up with, issues of sexual orientation or anything like that, and go back. So some of the more extreme states, and I don't want to bore your viewers, but I could give you chapter and verse of, Florida and Oklahoma and Texas. They want to bring back, putting the 10 Commandments in classrooms. They want to put a Bible in every kid's hands. The state of Florida is trying to outlaw the teaching of current events because it's too, it's too risque, it's too cutting edge. Whereas, as a lifelong social studies person myself, politics person, I'm absolutely horrified, by that, just the very notion, and see it as part of the greater conservative trend in America to basically try to dumb down everything, which is where, we see that in the attacks on public schools. We see it on the attacks on the Department of Education. And we see it, of course, with President Trump's attacks against Columbia University and now Harvard. It's all part of the same effort, basically, is to dumb everything down, so as to make the people more easily controllable.
Wow. I mean, that just kind of gave everything in a nutshell and kind of made it so clear for us. I was actually quite intrigued about the whole idea of how the syllabi is changing, knowing that the structure is more federal, so the state has and local authorities have more control over the schools and the systems. How the syllabi is changed and how is it getting affected from a revision of history point of view, which I think you kind of answered in the previous question. But how has this administration, despite having a federal structure and despite Colorado not getting affected so much, how has it impacted your work in the overall scheme of things? The way this administration is functioning, and how's that been different from his first term?
I don't think he got around to it in his first term. I think it was kind of pushed back, and now in the second term, he's basically untethered, and he's emboldened by the sense that he knows he's a lame duck already. And so if you're a lame duck in our system, usually that's going to be the last 2 years of an 8-year period. Trump's already a lame duck, and he knows it. And so he's just going to go ahead and swing out of his shoes, essentially trying to make the kind of changes that he wants. And quite frankly, it's not so much that we're seeing some kind of political ideology being forced upon us. Some states are taking an opportunity to do that because they've always wanted to do it. They want to get rid of, anything that is DEI, anything that is about diversity, anything that, makes America, our history to be more critical and make us more critical of ourselves and our own history. So that's always been this part of this whitewashing effort. But with President Trump now, this whole issue of attacking from the very top down, which would mean Harvard and our system and anybody else, right? Harvard simply being the one that is, that he picked the fight with most directly, but they certainly would not be the last. And everybody understands that. If he's going to go after them and try to basically make them bend at the knee to stop teaching anything that is critical, to stop, catering to a DEI kind of an initiative or policy directive, this is all part of that greater plan is simply authoritarianism. And of course, we're not the first to see those efforts. You guys are well aware, as I'm sure most of our listeners are, that this is modeled after authoritarian regimes in the past. This kind of structural control is exactly what, fascism is about. Authoritarian is about modern advantages of that. And I think Trump is simply, trying to follow that kind of a model historically, even though he himself, of course, has never been a student of history, nor does he ever claim to be. So there's a lot of mystery. We never know with Trump. What we're always trying to figure out is this part of a bigger agenda? Is this consistent with some type of ideology? Is there such a thing as Trumpism? Or is he just making this up as he goes along, right? And he's settling his own personal scores. I mean, the most recent, which I'm sure you guys have heard a few weeks ago, the rumor was, the conspiracy was that Trump was going after Harvard because his son Barron didn't get in, right? He didn't get accepted, and therefore, let's fight for the family. Now the rumor is Trump himself didn't get in back in the 1960s, And so, now he's taken upon him, to get back at them, just as he had a personal score to settle with Columbia University and the president of their board, where they had a real estate deal back in the 1970s that went south. And so how much of this really is ideology, how much of it is some kind of an ideological crusade? How much of it is just him basically trying to, settle old scores and empower and enrich himself? And so I don't know how far this is actually going to go. The courts have most recently, just a few days ago, shut down his ability to close the Department of Education. But we're not finished, obviously. He's going to keep going with this, and try to free up states to do what they want to do. Conservatives have always favored that, more of a states' rights approach, where they have local control, regional control, cultural control over their agenda, over their curriculum, over the way that they run their schools. Whereas liberals, of course, have been chastened by history and say, look, the last time we did that, we had segregated schools. The last time we did that, we had all kinds of problems. You cannot trust some of the states. The liberal conservative historical divide has come from as well. Whereas liberals would favor more of a British approach, quite frankly, more Unitarians, more consistent, and more efficient and more consistent in terms of offerings and more consistent in terms of the cultural historical impact. Whereas conservatives have always been more about devolution, to use your term in Britain, saying let's allow more local control, which makes sense. Like everything else in our system, sometimes state control makes sense, sometimes federal control makes sense, right? One size does not fit all, and that's true in a place like the UK as well.
I think that's really interesting as far as just the national trends. I know the answer to this question a little bit, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, because I think it's a really important point. And I think the way that you are doing this has been really interesting to me. But growing up in Evergreen, it's an incredibly purple area. I think there are people who are Trump supporters and there are people that are extremely liberal, and we coexist in one high school. And I think that's something that really served me well growing up. But I know that that's not the case for most high schools in the US. That's not the case for everyone. I think that it was amazing to grow up in that environment because I had lots of political conversations that were very meaningful when I was young, which then served me later. But because it's an incredibly purple area, you do have people who are on the extremes both ways, I think, as well. As a government teacher, how do you teach about Trump? I think this is a little bit different from maybe other presidents that you taught about in the past, because he's just different. You can take that word however you'd like to. He's very different. But how have you chosen to teach about Trump, and how has that changed from 2016 to now?
I don't think that my kind of philosophical approach to it has changed much at all. I think what we're seeing from Trump is just a lot more extreme. Day to day, it's a lot more extreme. As I said, he's kind of untethered. He's unhinged. And the people around him, in 2016 to 2021, there were still very serious people around him. There were people who were there to, that eventually acted as forms of checks against his more radical whims. Whereas now he has none of those people. None of those people are willing to work within the Trump administration. In fact, in each day we're seeing more and more people that were originally brought in have already fled. Obviously, most famously, Elon Musk, right? And yesterday, coming out against this big, beautiful bill and calling it an abomination. So we're seeing, the same kind of behavior when it comes to the teaching aspect of it. What I've always tried to do, and I know, Lil, you can speak to this, is I think that it's perfectly appropriate and it's important to teach about very cutting edge issues, to teach about real political views. And what you have to do is you have to establish the classroom as kind of a safe space, right, for differences. You have to encourage those differences. We have a lot of debating in my class. We have a lot of discussion in my class in a non-threatening way, right? It's not, we're not putting you on the spot, at least not until the very end of the course, right? Well, that's a different thing. But I think what you have to do from day one is kind of establish that rapport with the kids. It's going to be a safe space. You're going to hear both, right? I'm very, very careful in the back of my mind always to think about, it's my job to teach, not preach, right? So I'm going to present both sides always. You think for yourselves, right? That way I don't get in trouble with parents. I don't get anybody talking about, my liberal agenda or anything like that. And I think people respect that if you have the courage, the willingness. They also respect it because you obviously care so much about it. If your teachers are that invested and they think it's that important and they're that enthusiastic and that they're that knowledgeable, one of the things I have to do from day one, is you have to establish yourself as the smartest person in the room. And once you do that, then you have their attention, and I think, one of the things that I tell them from very day one. And I try to kind of, play this out throughout the course as I tell them, the only thing I care about is not whether you're liberal or conservative, right? I always quote Abraham Lincoln, who said, whatever you are, be a good one. And so what I encourage them to be, whether you are liberal or conservative, matters not at all to me. What you have to be is informed, right? It's not okay to be, a flame throwing, liberal who has no clue, nor is it okay to be a mouth breathing MAGA who has no clue. Those are not okay. And the thing, Lily, that I don't think you realize growing up in Evergreen is, yes, we do have political extremes in this community, but we also have a very, very high level of education. And that helps. That helps a lot, because the more educated people are, particularly in the United States, the more informed they are, the more regularly informed they are. And people who are more regularly informed, by very definition and statistically, data has proven for decades that they're more moderate. It's simple as that. And so they're more willing, to entertain different ideas, so long as, we can kind of agree to disagree on those. Whereas the people who are ill-informed are the ones that are very extreme. And of course, you see that in the UK as well, right? As soon as you go out into the hinterlands outside of the London bubble or Oxford or Cambridge or wherever it is, the people get, more extreme, and part of their extremism is always going to be accompanied by their ignorance, and we see that, which is why the kind of work that you guys are doing here, in the podcast and all the activism that we're seeing, that brings me hope. Okay, and we can talk about that. Obviously, I know that's coming in another question. It's, kind of where are the young people today? And I think what gives us hope is the access to that information, and the ability of the internet and podcasts in particular to amplify some of those messages. And so it brings to a more level playing field than the old days, where it was, just kind of corporate media and nothing else. Now people like yourselves are doing good work and amplifying messages that, heretofore may not have been, given any kind of a platform. And so keep up the good work. And that's what I've believed in my whole career. That's why I chose to do what I do.
That's cool. That's also an awesome Abraham Lincoln quote. So I might have to steal that from you, Chad. So my question sort of links, I guess, to people's understanding and knowledge. What role do your students think America should play in the world? And is there a pattern amongst your students in being more involved, or America sort of being the world's policeman, or whatever you want to say? What's their view of America?
I think most of them are still very optimistic, very proud, very patriotic. I mean, that's kind of bred here. We don't shy away from the tougher examples of where we've not always been right. We've not always been consistent. We've not always been principled, in terms of our leadership. And that's true of any country. We understand that. We try to be very open about it, patriotic, but also, kind of teach the dark side too. But I think most kids, because this goes back, at least 75, 80 years, going back to World War II. And prior to that, the debate was raging, after World War I, of course, about America first and our role, and, rejecting the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and all of that. We've been having that debate, for 100 years now in the United States. This is not a new debate. All right. And the difference here is that this is not really ideological. When President Trump talks about America first, people are fairly quick to understand that this is not something that we've never really gone down this road, right? The closest we came to it was after World War II, when we had arch conservatives led by Joseph McCarthy and others who were trying to take us out of NATO. And basically, President Eisenhower, who of course had served as Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces as well, he's the founder of NATO, essentially. He's the architect. And then from an American perspective, he saved us. He saved us from withdrawing from that and put us perpetually into that role of kind of global leadership. And I think most Americans, overwhelming statistically, we understand most Americans are all for that they believe in that they still believe in American leadership. And that's why when we hear it from President Trump, there's a big, big disconnect there as far as most Americans do not favor where he's taking us. Most Americans do not favor when we hear about, his relationship with Vladimir Putin, when he threatens Ukraine, when he, threatens to pull out of NATO or pull out of the UN. Most Americans have been born and bred with this going back, well before they were ever, even on this planet. And we've been living in a world where America has been the world's leader. And for the most part, that's been a very positive force. As I said, we're not perfect. We don't shy away from those kind of, realities of corruption, of examples of hypocrisy, things like that. But I think most people are very, very proud of that. So what you guys may hear over there is, well, Trump's doing this, therefore all Americans believe in that. That's not true at all, right? That's not true at all. And of course, that's an extremely small part of the Republican Party, right? Because when we hear America First, that slogan, just like America, Make America Great Again, that's not new. America First goes back to the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. This is nativist. It's anti-immigration. It's anti-communism. It's anti-everything they don't understand, everything they fear and loathe. And so, but most Americans, I would say, 75, 80% at least, they are in favor of global leadership, including most Republicans, because they have been the champions of it for generations. This goes back, to Eisenhower. This goes back to Richard Nixon. This goes back to Ronald Reagan. Trump is just a unique cat, guys, right? He does not have an ideology. His ideology is whatever enriches, he and his family. And so that's why he admires strong men, and he admires anyone's connection, that can enrich him. I mean, look at the recent trip that he took to the Middle East, right? Who did he visit, right? Well, he visits Qatar, he visits Saudi Arabia, he visits Syria. Why? And the UAE. Why? Because all of those countries can give him something. They gave him a skyscraper. They gave him, a $400 million jet. They gave him a new, $1 billion golf club. Who didn't he visit? Well, he didn't visit Israel. He didn't visit any of the democracies. He didn't visit Jordan. Why? Because they can't give him anything. So this is not like everything else in his world. This is not a kind of a scripted ideological crusade. This is more haphazard. It's very, very random. And I think most Americans are coming to be very, very, very well aware of that. And of course, most Americans stand in support of Ukraine. They stand in support of peace in the Middle East. And most Americans are very troubled, of course, by recent events. Israel, Gaza continues to perplex everybody. There's no easy way out. But most Americans understand, going back now 80 years, that we have an important role to play, right? With that kind of power comes responsibility. And most Americans don't shy away from that responsibility. I think most of my students agree with that.
And so how do your students react when you teach them about other governments, and other countries, and does their view of how things are run in the United States change when they see what potential alternatives there are?
Yeah, it's difficult because you can't get into too much detail given the kind of curriculum restraints I have and time restraints I have. But we certainly can point out differences, make some comparisons by way of helping them to understand our own. And I think, most of my students, and I've taught in different states and I've taught in different kind of schools, most of them understand, they kind of come into it with a fairly mature perspective and say, yeah, we know we're not perfect. It's been a long, winding, difficult journey to get to where we are. And of course, that's why there will always be some pushback, and I think the Trump years are simply, a manifestation of some of that pushback where you say, we've done a lot of good work. We've done a lot of good things. But the reality is in the past 30, 40 years, our system is not really serving, mainstream Americans because of the wealth gap, the growing wealth gap. And people, with the internet, with social media, I think that's exacerbating some of those differences, right? It's creating worldwide, obviously in your world as well as mine, there is that constant kind of duality, right, of the internet and social media where you say, the good news is, macro sociological communities where you guys, people like you, are creating these communities. You're creating that connectivity, which is breeding hope, and connecting across boundaries and borders. Whereas the flip side of that, of course, is the inevitable, balkanization of it all, where people, are more easily flocking to their own little bubbles, and that's creating a more coarse and more crass and more cruel, and people are acting in public more the way that they act online. And I think that that's somewhat problematic. So what I try to teach my kids in everything, it's not just governmental institutions, but when it comes to civil rights, or when it comes to equal rights, or when it comes to history, I'm simply trying to create perspective in their brains, right? The more perspective you have, the more moderate, the more thoughtful you are, right? And so the idea of, with them today of saying, we're not perfect as a country. Nobody thinks that we are. Let's continue to learn about our history. Let's continue to learn and make some comparisons. Why do the Chinese do what they do, right? Why, do the Russians do what they do? Why do the British do what they do? Well, you have to understand the history. You have to understand the complications, the geography, the political and cultural climate. And that's why I think a lot of people probably in your country, and Lily and I have talked about this quite a bit, is, you misunderstand if you take a reductive perspective on Trump and just say, well, all Americans are like this, or, this is the inevitable, or America's falling apart. It's not that simple, right? Just like, any other country, you have to understand the nuances, the history, the political climate, even the geography and the history of it all really makes a big difference.
It's very interesting how one of the points that has really lingered with me, that what you mentioned, Chad, is that the more informed they are, the more moderate they become.
Mm-hmm.
Just to kind of put things I mean, when you were telling us about it, I was trying to think of it from an Indian perspective as well. And it's interesting that actually doesn't apply in India. You may be highly informed or you may be highly educated, but there is a certain sense of ignorance that is actually increasing, where the similarities between Trump and Modi is staggering. So this whole idea that we're going to make India great again, we're going to go back to a pre-Mughal era where, the Hindu kings ruled, this constant revisionism of history and so on and so forth. I was trying to think of a question around it when you kind of mentioned as why does a country do what it does, or why does it behave the way it does, and kind of, people need to understand the history and the culture and the context of India, or the growth or the regression that it's seeing at this point in time as well. So that was just something that I wanted to add from an Indian perspective. But, seeing this climate that it is, and a lot of it is perpetuated by the media, right? So staying informed is a fairly difficult task, right? So how does this impact the students when it comes to being part of the government or being public servants? And especially because we're seeing a steady increase around the world, actually, in many advanced economies or advanced democracies, there's a certain dissociation from elected governments among the youth. So what about your students? Do you see similar patterns, or do you see them having a lot of interest as well?
I actually do. I see more interest today than I ever have. And the reason for that, I think it's twofold. One is that, people like you guys and the work that you're doing, the political activism, social activism has never been easier, right? The tools are there, right? And people understand that, it's not incredibly difficult to be involved. Whereas in the past, even when I was a kid, you wouldn't even have given that any thought. Your whole world was just your own little world, right? And then what you saw on the TV. But today, these kids, young people are connected all over the world. Again, those kind of communities, that macro sociological community is very, very real to them. And I think American students in particular, and I can't speak for younger people all over the world, but I think there's probably some similarities when it comes to some of the challenges, right? We see two things happening at the same time. Number one, in America, we're seeing our level of political efficacy go down, right? There's less trust, right? There's less trust in the institutions. There's less trust in, the ideas and how well it's serving and creating equal opportunity in America. We understand that. So that frustration, of course, makes it easier for nationalists and authoritarians to kind of, fan those flames, right? And it makes it easier, just as we saw historically, if we go back 100 years ago, that the easy way, is to prey upon those differences, identity, politics, nationalism. And certainly we see that in India as well, right? We see that in the United States. We see that with the MAGA movement. So that frustration is there. But on the other hand, I think that my students, and I've seen this really for the past 15 years or so, my students are becoming more aware because they're starting to realize, in a way, at a level that we probably haven't seen since the 1960s in America, and that is that what the government what they are doing on a daily basis, whatever they do, in terms of policies, makes a difference to the young people. And they're starting to understand that, right? They understand because people, for example, more and more kids, the most recent polling says that at least 10% of American teenagers now identify as something other than heterosexual. Well, if that's true, and those kind of numbers are true, well, then obviously the government coming after them, the government trying to limit them, they see, it's not an existential threat. It's a real threat. It's there. Climate change. These kids get it. And they look at our government in particular, and they look at the Republican Party and go, well, if you're not going to do anything, then we're going to have to do it, right? School shootings. Lily's generation in America are the first to grow up with that kind of reality where we have to do, safety drills and we have to do lockdown drills and things. The kids understand from a very early age that government matters. Right. So I think we went through a full generation, probably my generation, where we were more detached. We were more apathetic, more cynical, because we realized, well, hey, they tried to change the world in the 60s and it didn't work. And so, by the time we got into the late 70s, 80s, it was just about, well, let's just get rich. Right. Everybody for themselves. Let's just go make money. Who cares about changing the world? But the issues we see today that matter with young people, climate change, equity, gun violence in America. Those are the biggest three. The kids are not stupid. They understand that government has the ability, the power to affect those either positively or negatively. And so these kids are more engaged than any other time, that I've been teaching, because they have to be, and they understand that.
Yeah, that's good to hear. That's very hopeful. We've been trying to end these episodes on a more hopeful note. So I think that's a good thing to hear, because often we're kind of doom and gloom at the end of these. That also segues me perfectly into this next question that I have. I know that you just delivered the graduation address, the commencement address. So this is kind of perfect. Sneakily, I threw in this question because I knew that as well, Tom had said. But as a teacher of seniors who are about to graduate, what is your advice for all of these young people who are graduating and they're facing big life changes during this period of lots of political, economic, social uncertainty? What advice did you give them at the graduation ceremony as they're heading into this change in their lives?
I centered my remarks on three quick things, and I'll just make it a quick version for you guys as well. Number one, because there's so much change, and it's not just political, right? I think AI, of course, is changing the world, and we understand that. The job market has never been more kind of fluctuant, fluid, chaotic. You can call it what you will. And so what I told them, number one, in terms of your own work, is that the first thing you have to do is be grounded, in your own principles, what those things are that matter to you. I said, find your North Star, right? And those things are a combination of personal and professional. What are the things that matter to you, right? Number two, in this kind of ever-changing world in terms of the direction of your career, because that is going to be so fluctuant, because it's so unknowable, into the future, what matters most, of course, are going to be your skills, and those skills have to be cultivated. And part of the skill building is to understand not only what you value, work that the kind of impact that you have and what that work gives you, whether it's, financial advantages or whether it's, social activism, whether it's, climate change and environmentalism, whatever those are. But you also have to be really good at what you do. It's not good enough to just say, well, go follow your heart. In this day and age, you better develop some skills and you better be really damn good at it. So whatever it is, work your butt off at it so that you will always have transferable, marketable skills, right? And I look at that, in my decision, I bounced around a bit after college. What do I want to do? And then when I finally decided to become a teacher, I worked incredibly hard at it, to be really good. And that's what led me to be then able to live where I wanted to live in the United States. I said, well, I'm a good enough teacher. I'll get a job wherever you want. And that was my sales pitch to my wife at the time, was to move cross country. I said, where do you want to live? The beach or the mountains? And I'll get a job either place. And I'm not trying to be arrogant. What I'm saying is, if you're really good at what you do, there will always be a market for you. Okay. And then lastly, Tom, I hit him with Lincoln one more time. And I said, whatever you are, be a good one. And that means, in terms of, as a family member, as a community member, as a global citizen, all those things, try to keep that mantra in the back of your head, be a good one, whatever that means. And I think those are principles kind of to live by today, particularly given all the chaos these kids are facing. And they're well aware of that. So if you stay, empowered within yourself, become very, very good at what you want to do, and then try to stay grounded within that kind of moral compass. And I think that's very important. I think everybody, if you keep those things in mind and you're kind of true to them, then I think you have every reason to be optimistic about the future.
Like I said, we never really end on the most positive of notes on this podcast. So we actually did for this episode, which I appreciate. But thank you so much for talking with us. This has been such a good conversation. And I have been looking forward to figuring out how we can make this episode work for a while. So I think this was the perfect timing. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. This was very cool.
Well, I so appreciate it, guys. And I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Keep it up. Keep up the good work, huh?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chad. I mean, a few things which I wanted to just say. When are you free next to do another episode with us? Because this was amazing. I could listen to you for hours. This was amazing.
It's the white hair, Sid. I'm old. I have a lot of perspective, wisdom, whether I like it or not.
This was one of the most insightful episodes I think we've ever done. And I think in the beginning of the episode, you had mentioned that it's an honor for you to be a part of this, but I would actually say that it's an honor for us to have you part of this episode. So thank you so much for that, sir. I think there's just so many more questions that it kind of leaves us with, and so much more food for thought, which is really good. because you really want to figure things out, right?
Well, every so often, if you guys need an American exchange reporter correspondent, I'm always available. All right.
We'll take you up on that. If I just had to ask you to give you like a 2-word or a 1-line answer, if you were a history teacher 50 years down the line in 2075, how would you rate this period that the United States is going through? If you had to describe it in 1 line, how would you describe it to your students?
In class, I talk about what I metaphorically the American cha-cha, where what I mean by that is America is a constant example of going forward and then going back, meaning progression, regression. There is always a backlash. And I simply look at this period as similar to other periods like the McCarthy era, in that same vein, where we made a lot of progress. The Obama years were very, very positive in the United States in very, very many ways in terms of global leadership, in terms of equity and social justice. And then there's going to be a backlash and a reaction to that. And unfortunately, we're dealing with that backlash right now.
I would obviously echo what Sid and Lily said. It's always difficult going last because everyone said the amazing things. But I have to admit that because I went over to the US in October and November last year, big politics geek. So it's great to hear about you and you teaching students and this generation. And I have to admit, I came away from that trip just thinking, I don't think I know what America is anymore. And that sucked because I was like, oh, well, I thought, this is the promise of America. And,
right.
Yeah, this is why. I don't know why I get emotional, but it's a reason for it. I think, you get told a lot of stories when you're younger, but I remember going back from school and turning TV on to watch Obama's inauguration because I was like, yeah, okay, this is a moment. This is history. This is what we're witnessing. And he said it as well. He talks about, what Dr. King talked about, which was the sort of the long reign of history. It bends and it changes.
The arc of history. Yeah.
The arc of history. So I was always trying to be optimistic about it. But then the America that I saw, it was a very ugly side of it, right? It's very, as you say, there's lots of nativism. I mean, I accidentally went to the Trump. I sort of was trying to get the subway to the Met, and then I ended up like outside where there was the Trump rally in New York at Madison Square Garden, and there's all these like red caps everywhere, and everyone was just trying to get. The New Yorkers were just getting on with it. Tourists were taking pictures, and then you had all these red caps like, lined up around the corner. And I just thought, what have I entered into? What is this sort of circus? Because that's sort of what it felt like. So our conversation today has given me a lot of hope, and sort of it's nice to hear a different perspective because it's so easily to be swept away with all the negativity, with because our algorithms are feeding this very unhealthy view of the world, right? And education is such an important part of that. It lifts people out of poverty, it lifts people out of ignorance, and it's just been great. It's been very uplifting, and so I really appreciate your service as well, but also everything you've talked about today. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that. It's that Madison Square Garden scene. That's funny to even think about, but we've done that before as well. We did that back in 1940. We had a rally that was almost identical, and it was Charles Lindbergh, and it was Charles Coughlin, and it was McCarthy was supposed to be the headline speaker. Again, progression, regression. We've been there before. Unfortunately, as I've talked to Lily about, one thing you kind of come to a realization is that America, our pathologies, if you will, we do still cling to the idea that we are an idea. We are, we're not just a nation state, but kind of an idea, and given hope to people for hundreds of years. But in that, you have to also remember, that we are the most diverse country in the world. And with that diversity comes a lot of conflict. There's going to be that. Our geographic history means there's going to be a lot of guns, that goes with it, and that can make things worse. Social media certainly is making things worse. But our three pathologies that we continue to struggle with, and all we're seeing them now is just kind of inflamed once again, is ignorance. Because, if you look at the United States, the American people are not stupid, but they are ignorant when it comes to the OECD. When you look at those nations, 21 nations, we rank 17th. We've been blissfully ignorant, for hundreds of years, given our isolation geographically and our power. So we sit atop this, power perch, and we're not threatened. Whereas, countries like yours, you have to deal with the world. You have to deal with your neighbors. Well, we don't, right? So ignorance is a problem. 2, greed is a problem. That's capitalism. It's everybody for themselves, right? We understand that. We've been widely criticized and should be for that. And then 3, the last pathology, which has been with us from the very beginning, is bigotry. It just is. And it's, that can take the form of racism, sexism, homophobia. It can be, religion. I mean, those 3 things, and they rear up, every so often. They become inflamed, and we see that. But usually, as Obama talked about, we're able, to kind of write our course and find new leadership and a new generation. And I'm hoping that the Trump years are just that. It's just an aberration. People are seeing just how cruel it is, how ignorant it is, how chaotic it is. And hopefully it won't last very long, right? We'll recover from this just like we've recovered from other eras, similarly back in the 1950s or 1960s as we went forward. So it's an evolution, guys, right?
All right. With that, let's bring this episode to a close. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the conversation. Please subscribe to the podcast. Feel free to leave a comment or a rating wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for joining us, Dad. It was wonderful to have you on the podcast.
Guys.
I'm glad we've got a Colorado correspondent now.
There you go. For Middle America, you can say that, right?
Exactly. So geographically, it's perfect for any other internal travel that you need to do. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. I'm Tom Spett.
I'm Sid Kodapati.
And I'm Lily Mott. Thanks for listening to the Political Dispatch.